Sometimes we have these phrases, like especially phrases when someone says thank you, like how we respond to someone who says thank you. There's all these different ways. There's the common "you're welcome," but I actually came across something that said that Gen Z right now, maybe Gen Alpha, they don't say "you're welcome." They'll just say "no problem." I think that's interesting because I say "no problem." I like the Australian "no worries," the "not at all." That's kind of all those things are kind of fun, but there's one phrase that I think is kind of just interesting when someone says, "Hey, thank you." Our response is, it's the least I could do. And I think about that because it's an interesting thing to say, but I think like, well, no, that's not true. I don't know, it's not the least you could do. Like you could have done less, probably. I mean, you could do nothing, but at the same time, it also is true. And what I mean by that is this. I think what you're saying, when we say it's the least I could do, we're saying is, this is the least I could do as your friend, or this is the least I could do as your son, or this is the least I could do as your sibling, or this is the least I could do as your coworker. Another way to say it is, this is the least I could do and still have a relationship with you. Because I think that's real. That's probably true. I mean, really, truly, if that's accurate, if someone says thank you, and you say that's the least I could do, if that's accurate, what you're saying is, I did the minimum. Which I think that's fine. I mean, I had a friend back in the day, and he said, if the minimum wasn't good enough, it wouldn't be called the minimum. So the minimum must be good enough. I think it's really good to know the minimum. I think it's really good to know, like, what is the least I could do? I think it's good to know where the floor is. Another way to say it like that. A couple weeks ago, a couple different Sundays, we were asking about the ideal, right? So we had a homily on rest, and the question was, do you have a picture of your ideal rest day? Like what's the heights? What's the perfect rest day? Another couple weeks ago, we asked the question, in your stage of life, in your season of life, what does a win look like? And in both those questions, we're asking about the ideal, right? We're asking about kind of the thing you strive for, which is awesome. It's so good to have a clear picture of what a win looks like. It's great to have a very clear picture of what does rest look like. I think it's really great to know, okay, what am I striving for? Because we're made to strive. It's good to know where's the ceiling. But I think it's also as valuable to know where the floor is. That on a daily basis, to know, okay, what actually is the minimum? What actually is the least I could do? With myself, like what's the least I could do and still be okay as me? What's the least I could do in life? What's the least I could do as a married person, if you're a married person? What's the least I could do as a son or daughter of your parents? What's the least I could do for my friends? What's the least I could do for my health and still be okay? We're not talking the ideal, we're not talking what we're striving for, we're not talking about the ceiling, we're talking about where's the floor. And I think we need to go there because here we are at Mass. It's good to ask the question, what is the least you could do when it comes to the most important relationship in your life? What's the least you could do when it comes to God? When it comes to God, what's the minimum? Like when it comes to God, where's the floor? Because remember this, the minimum isn't nothing. But to ask the question, what is the least you could do and still have a relationship? And I'm not saying something like, what's the least I can do in the sense of just checking a box. That's not what we're going for. Because like Jesus said in the gospel today, he says, this people, they honor me with their lips. Like they're checking boxes all the time. But their hearts are far from me. And that's the problem, right? Because the least I can do is not just get by, skate by, check boxes. What's the least I could do and still give the Lord my heart? I think one of the biggest frustrations we all have, this is like everyone across the board as Christians, as Catholics, it's that I have faith in my head, but it hasn't yet reached my heart, right? That reality that I believe, like I know, but I haven't been able to cross those 12 inches, right, from my head to my heart. I've heard it said many times that the longest 12 inches in the universe is the foot of space that lives between my head and my heart. The hardest distance to travel is that distance between my head and my heart. And so the question is, what's the minimum? What's the least I could do to cross that distance between my head and, or even is it possible? How do we do it? Like, how do we, right now, today, cross that distance between our head and our heart so we don't end up like Jesus says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Well, I think James gives us a clue. It's the second reading today, the book of James, the letter of James. And it's the most simple and it's the most straightforward way to bridge the gap between our head and our heart. James says it kind of like this. He says, okay, all those things you believe, act on them. Like all those things you know about God, do them. That's why he says, be doers of the word and not hearers only, who delude yourselves. You're fooling yourselves. I would say this, the most direct way from your head to your heart passes through your hands. All those things you know, put them into action. It turns out that that's the least we can do. And I think this is fascinating because James goes on to talk about 2 of the 3 essential things that we need. So here's the interesting thing. James already presumes that we're going to be worshiping God, right? James already knows in the book of James, letter of James, he already knows we're worshiping God. That's the first thing. We need to be worshiping God. But he also talks about 2 other things we need to be doing. He says, religion that is pure and undefiled does 2 things. It is where you care for orphans and widows in their affliction, and you keep yourself unstained by the world. So here's James. He says, here's the minimum. Here's the floor. The minimum is this, these 3 things: worship, love of neighbor, and holiness. Those are the 3 things that every one of us needs to do. These are the least I could possibly do. Another way to say it is love God in your actions. That's worship. Love your neighbor in your actions. That's charity, right? That's helping. That's service. And then thirdly, reject everything that keeps you from these things. That's holiness. Again, love God in your actions, worship. Love your neighbor in your actions, charity, service. And reject everything that keeps you from these things, pursuit of holiness. Because we know this. We know this, that our actions, our choices, that's the most direct route between our head and our heart. And it goes through our hands. It's what we do. So James goes on to say, if you don't do this, you're deluded. James says that if you don't do this, if you're a hearer and not a doer, you are fooling yourself. Because why? Because every act of worship is meant to get to our heart. Every act of caring for our neighbor is meant to get to our heart. Every act of rejecting sin and choosing grace is meant to get to our heart. Another way to say it is every act of worship, of love, and of holiness is meant to draw us closer to God. Do you know that actually the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, they had a word for something that draws you close to God? You actually probably heard this word before. The Hebrew word that means to draw, something which draws close, is the Hebrew word korban. So in the Jewish world, if something were there, it was there to draw you close to God. That's what korban means, something which draws you close. If there was something that would draw you close to God, you call that korban. And so there were sacrifices that were korban because they draw you close to God. There are prayers that are korban. There are acts of charity, acts of love that are korban. There's prayers that are korban. Why? Because all of those actions are something that draw you close. The problem is this. The problem is there's more than one way that we can delude ourselves. There's more than one way we can fool ourselves. One is, as St. James says, by being a hearer and not a doer. Another way is by being a doer, but doing the wrong things. And I don't mean doing the wrong things in the sense of doing sins. I mean doing the wrong things in the sense of tap dancing at a ballet, right? That's not the right place, not the right time, not the right thing. Or another way to say it is fasting when it's time to feast. I'm doing the wrong thing. And there's an example of this in the gospel today. So the gospel, here's this whole story of Jesus' disciples are being criticized by the Jews because they're eating with unwashed hands. And Mark goes on to say that's actually a tradition of the elders, tradition of the Pharisees, is that, you don't eat with unwashed hands. He's not talking about cleanliness. He's not talking about sanitation. What he's talking about, or hygiene, what he's talking about is that the Pharisees had this mindset. It was not a bad mindset. The mindset was this: hey, we were given rules about how to worship God in the temple. And so if you worship God in the temple, you wash your hands a certain way. If you worship God in the temple, you wash your vessels in a certain way. If you worship God in the temple, you wash your clothes and all these things in a certain way. Those are all good things. The Pharisees said, you know what? Those are good things. And those are meant to do what? They're meant to be the route from the head to the heart. They're meant to be korban, something that draws you close. How about this? How about we bring temple worship into daily life? That'd be awesome. That if washing like this in the temple is great, that purification is great, I'm going to wash like that at home. If taking care of the vessels of worship are important, like to do like this, I'm going to take my home vessels and treat them like this. What I'm going to do is if I do this, if I bring this into my daily life, then my whole life will be marked by an awareness of God's presence. It's actually a really, really good thing. But that really, really good thing is a ceiling. That really, really good idea is an ideal. And there's a problem there because they began seeing what was optional as now being essential. They started treating that ceiling like, oh, that's the new floor. They started treating that maximum, that's the new minimum. They started treating that ideal as now that's the least you can do. And that is heavy. That's burdensome. I know people would say this, they say like, well, you're one to talk. Catholics, I know you guys do. You guys have so many rules, are you kidding me? Like, what's the minimum for Catholics? I think that's a great question. What is the minimum for Catholics? In fact, what are the precepts Catholics have? I mean, in the gospel today, it says you're teaching as commandments, mere human precepts. Does the Catholic Church have any precepts? And the answer is yes. And these precepts are this. So basically, we have the commandments. Obviously, that's not precepts. Those are the commandments of God, Exodus. You have the Beatitudes, Jesus himself in Matthew's gospel. And then the church has 5 precepts. And these 5 precepts of the church, this is like what the church says, hey, you want to know the least you can do? These 5 things. And here's what they are. They're very, very simple. Number 1 is attending Mass every Sunday and holy day of obligation. Okay, so Mass on Sunday, worship. While at Mass, at least once a year, the second one is at least once a year receiving Holy Communion during Easter season. Now, the reason it was only once a year is because there was a time where people were so intimidated by the holiness of the Eucharist that they would go their entire lives and never receive communion because they're like, no, that's really Jesus. I need to stay away. And the Pope was like, listen, guys, at least once. So go to Mass every Sunday and Holy Day, receive communion at least once. And then third is go to confession at least once a year. So this first 2 is worship. Second, go to confession once a year. The third is to observe days of fasting and abstinence. So that's holiness. And the fourth is to provide for the needs of the church according to your ability. And that's caring for others. So think about these. These are the 3 aspects that James talks about as essential to religion. The church and the 5 precepts of the church say, okay, this is the floor. This is the minimum. This is the least you can do. And I think the least we can do is just, let's put this in context. Because again, we can be so overwhelmed and say like, no, the church has this whole big thing. You have to do all these things. No, it's just so simple. Go to Mass every Sunday and Holy Day. Once a year at least, receive Holy Communion. Once a year, go to confession. Observe days of fasting and abstinence. That's overwhelming. No, there are 2 days of fasting and the Fridays in Lent that are also days of abstinence. So it's not a whole lot. And lastly is give. Provide for the needs of the church according to your means. It doesn't say you need to have 10% you give. Just whatever you have, whatever your means are, give. Just like St. James said. Love God in your actions, worship. Love your neighbor in your actions, service. And reject all the things that get in between you and those other things. Worship, charity, and holiness. This is the least we can do. So let's go back to the gospel. As we said in the gospel, there were people who were saying now, okay, here we're taking the optional and making them essential. It went even further. Now, in some readings that we omitted today for the reading, they're still there in the Bible, in Matthew's gospel, Mark's gospel. Jesus also condemns folks because he says, what you've done, some of you even do this. You know the commandment number 4 of honoring your father and mother, taking care of your parents. Some of you are actually saying, okay, the help that would go to take care of my parents, I'm declaring that, here's the Hebrew word, I'm declaring that korban. And now it's dedicated to God, and now I don't have to take care of my parents anymore because I've dedicated that to God. Remember what korban means? Something which is meant to draw close. What happened, and what Jesus is condemning, is not only did people take what was optional and make it essential, people began to say that what was meant to be the route to the heart had been made into a roadblock. They were using the optional to avoid the essential. It was a way to do things and at the same time withdraw my heart. So here's the question. What do we do? Okay, well, we know we have to be doers of the word, not hearers only. that the route from my head to my heart passes through my hands in worship and service and in holiness. We have to ask the question, I think, how can I strive after this? Like, really, what is the ideal? Like, when it comes to your relationship with the Lord, when it comes to your giving Him worship, when it comes to taking care of your neighbor, when it comes to holiness, like, how can you strive after that courageously? How can you live heroically? That's awesome. What is the ideal of this day? Or what's the ideal of this month? What's the ideal of my life? What's the ceiling? That is a great question to ask. But we also have to ask the question, where's the floor? Not just how can I live this on my best day, how can I live this every day, even on my worst day? Well, we have the precepts, but also what do you have personally? So back years ago, there was a man, his name is Father Ben. I've talked about Father Ben here many, many times. But when Father Ben was 17 years old, he decided, okay, his minimum was every single day he would read a minimum of 15 minutes of the Bible a day. That's what he would do. And he did. I mean, he still does. He's had multiple strokes. He's had multiple, just things just happen to him again and again. But Father Ben's minimum is 15 minutes of Bible a day. I mentioned this also. I have a nephew who heard that when he was in 6th grade. And he said, okay, 10 minutes. His minimum was 10 minutes. And I remember even just when he got into high school and he was like, man, overwhelmed by homework and sports and all these things. And his mom called me up to say, like, hey, Max is still doing this 10 minutes a day. Can he have a break? I'm like, oh, hey, it's his minimum. Whatever you think your minimum is, because that's an incredible minimum. When I was in high school, I wanted to pray a rosary a day, at least. But I had a minimum. That was my ideal. My minimum was, and this is embarrassing, but it's my minimum. My minimum was I would pray 1 Our Father, 1 Hail Mary, 1 Glory Be, and then a prayer where I, in the name of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I spiritually adopt an unborn baby who's in danger of abortion. And I would do that, I'd be exhausted, I'd have, not only have a busy day, sometimes when I was just like, man, I am in sin, I can't even lift my eyes to the Lord, those are the prayers that I'm going to pray. 1 Our Father, 1 Glory Be, 1 Hail Mary, and this prayer to spiritually adopt a baby in danger of abortion. That was my minimum. And that, I'll tell you this, that helped me navigate high school. Because why? Because I think it's really important. We need to strive. We need to have a ceiling, but we also need to have a floor. And this is the last thing. I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking that, well, that's super easy. Just take a minimum thing. That's going to fit. It's going to be perfect. I don't have to rearrange anything in my life. Because why? Because even the minimum sometimes is disruptive. So 15 to 20 years ago, my mom, she found this thing, she found a hutch, right? A place you put plates and dishes and cups and kettles and beds. But just, a hutch. She found a hutch that she really, really liked. And she went to my dad. She's like, this hutch is my dream hutch. I don't know if everyone has a dream hutch, but she had a dream hutch. She said, this is the hutch. And she said, but it doesn't fit in the kitchen. And so after many, many conversations, my dad agreed that they would remodel that part of the house, the kitchen and dining area, in order to fit the hutch. And so I remember when they were under construction, I just thought, oh, they just expand this a little bit, knock out a wall, maybe push out this, or rearrange the tables. They tore down everything. I remember showing up on the site at one point. There were no walls, there was no ceiling, there was simply a fireplace and a chimney sticking up into the sky. In order to fit the minimum, this small little piece of furniture, this hutch, it involved a big rearrangement of life. So again, as I'm saying, we want to strive after the ideal. We want to live courageously, live heroically, pursuing the Lord in worship and in loving our neighbor and in holiness. But we also need to find our minimum. Sometimes that minimum is nothing. And sometimes that minimum is something that causes us we need to remodel completely the lives that we're living. But we have to remodel. And we have to have a ceiling. We also have to have a floor. We have to have the ideal, but we also have to have the minimum. And we have to have what's the most I can give. But I also have to know what's the least I can do.